excited for us to all be gathered here to talk about Africa and NLP today. And as we're heading into this conversation, I'd just like for us to have a question to sit in the back of our minds as we have this discourse. When we call a language low resourced, who decided that we should call it low resourced? That the Luo language is spoken by millions of people. Uganda has 8.5 million speakers, and Hausa is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world. None of these are low-resourced languages. However, they are under-resourced. That in itself is a political fact, not a natural one. Today's conversation is about what happens when communities decide to change that on their own terms. We are very, very fortunate to have these four phenomenal people who are doing important work that is at the intersection of African languages, AI, and community power. Today we have Bonaventure Dusu, who is a researcher and Masakhane community member whose work on named entity recognition, literally teaching AI how to know African names, starts from a deceptively simple premise. When a technology can't recognize your name, it often robs you of your personhood. Secondly, we have Deborah Kanuvala. She is an NLP engineer and researcher based in Ghana, and her work is on fair machine learning and AI ethics. She's also one of the most prominent voices building the next generation of women in AI across West Africa. Our third guest is Tajuddin Gwadabe. He's a researcher and a long-standing member of the Masakhane community, whose work spans NLP for West African languages and the community infrastructure that makes this research work possible. And we also have Lilian Wanzare, who is a computational linguist and the chair of computer science at Maseno University in Kenya. She leads both the Ken Corpus project, which is premised on building language datasets from the ground up with Kenyan communities, and is working on groundbreaking work for AI for Kenyan Sign Language. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this great panel. And so our first point of reflection, or the first question that will set us up, is thinking about something concrete. Each of you on the panel has been building something, datasets, models, community infrastructure. What does that work actually look like on the ground? And what does it cost in time, in trust, in labor? That doesn't always show up in academic papers. I'd like to put this question first to Bonaventure.
Hi, Lydia, and thank you everyone for being here. And I was trying to answer the question as like where currently my research has been going. Um, I would say that of course we don't know who gets to decide like why our languages are called low resourced. We don't know who gets to decide like how to utilize or how much to utilize our languages. Um, But I took a step back, and for me today, my research is about, first of all, acknowledging all those limitations. Yes, I know we have low resource, we have limited data and like compute and everything. Shifting from the data perspective to something more theoretical and modeling perspective, I know I have those constraints. How can I exploit, use those constraints to be a little bit smarter than the person who doesn't have those constraints. So throughout my PhD, that's what I have been working on, building new algorithms and techniques that are that have been and will keep hopefully enabling building better, I would say more efficient and more effective models without relying too much on like supervised or like data, like models that are not data hungry, but that are high performing. Yeah, so I think that's what I can say for the moment. We might dive deep in later.
That's fantastic. And thanks so much for sharing with us your learnings and the techniques that you're using to make NLP more inclusive of African languages. I'm just going to push a little bit on that to understand more the constraints and the difficulties that exist in working in this context. If you had to think about it comparatively, how much more difficult and costly is it for you in time, in labor, in ways that don't necessarily show up in publications. Do you have challenges like that you've experienced, and how did you overcome them?
Well, obviously, yes. I don't believe that even in like high resource settings, I don't believe there's anything in life which is without challenges. But of course, like there are more challenges on like the low resource languages. I guess it takes more, I would say, time to understand the problem underneath. To the like, I like to think of things like very theoretically, mathematically, and understand how we can like use those tools to like shift the paradigm. So in real life, it is a problem. For instance, recently I was working on a paper, um, which worked pretty much well like existing benchmarks, like English-centric benchmarks. But I was looking at Afro-centric benchmarks, and like it was a trouble. Had to rethink my whole like methodology to be able to have it being also adapted to the African context, which was important for me. So I think depending on like the work, depending on who is doing the work, challenges are going to be like leveraged or like quantified differently. But from my perspective, I have been mainly dealing from how uh, can I use the mathematical tools that I have to address those like limitations? It can be low data, it can be like biases, it can be scarcity, whatsoever it is. But how can I alleviate that using like mathematical tools? Um, yeah, I think that's how I answer the question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that great exchange. And I'm really appreciative of that perspective from the thought process as a researcher and a mathematician. I'm really keen to hear from Deborah and the experience that you've had in terms of not just building this technology, but building a community centered on equity and ethics, with a focus on West African states and with a focus on equality. What has your experience been like, and what has this cost been?
Okay, so first I would say that generally on the African continent, there's actually a lot of work that people have been doing in recent times, from either creating data sets to building models like African-centered models. But generally, you can think about it that it's like from two directions. Africans ourselves also sort of building these technologies for ourselves from our own lived experiences. And then you have on the second hand, you have like external actors. So on the ground, what are we even doing for ourselves? So, as someone, I worked as an NLP engineer, and in one of our projects, the idea was actually focused on building chatbots for African banks. And the main idea was that we wanted to um, have these chatbots be able to engage in local languages. So in the context of Ghana, it was like Tree, and that's probably because most of the people who probably would interact with these chatbots as to the customers of the bank would necessarily not speak English and would want to speak in their local dialect. So it's really not about whether you want to just build a chatbot that people would just interact with, but actually ensure that it's rooted in the language and context in which the Ghanaian people or African people live. And the difficulty that has always come with these things sometimes is actually with dealing with idiomatic expressions or particular local meanings to things. So, for example, I speak Dagari, and one expression we have in our language is like Buka Jongabora Kanumbri Nana, which actually just means like, what does a blind man want if not an eye? And this is just something that if you find someone else translating, would translate it on a literal sense, but actually has a much deeper meaning to it. So, from my experience, I would say that the work has just not always been super like technical from that sense, but also the process has involved humans and language and how people understand things. And as such, it's important that the work that we do is actually important and impactful to the same people who would be using these things. And in doing that, mostly there's associated costs, right? That the people who use it would actually need to believe that the data that has been translated or transcribed actually represents the meanings behind them, right? And all of these usually also cost labor. So there's also this unfairness that comes with the associated labor costs in terms of doing these translations or annotations generally. So in a broad sense, this how I think about what's on the ground in terms of this.
Amazing. So much of what I've gathered from your exchanges, um, nuance has immense value when we think about African languages, and there's the invisible labor, the people who are doing the what exists at the base of the work, the transcription and the annotation, and so much of that ends up being invisible labor. And at this point, I'd like to bring in Tajuddin, because he has quite a bit of experience working in the community context continentally. And I'd like to ask him about, just building up on that, I'd like to ask him about how we've been able to see and recognize this invisible labor, and in what ways we've been able to improve that in the community, as well as other possible challenges that have existed while you're trying to bridge this gap.
Okay, thank you, Lydia. So I'll start off by mentioning a few more challenges that I see when you look at it from a community perspective, and kind of things that don't necessarily translate to what you have in a paper. So looking at it from a community perspective, you see that Masakhane's work has always been trying to look at NLP from a broader perspective of many languages. And then when it comes to writing a paper, one of the obvious things is that you kind of then think about language families, and it's kind of really difficult to look at languages as themselves. So like the different nuances that happen between a language is kind of abstracted when you're looking at it from a paper. So those nuances include that, for example, I speak Hausa. So in Hausa you have like 6, 7 different dialects, but you would hardly see any paper that it's actually working on any of the different dialects except the main one that is studied in schools. And then the next thing is you're looking at language from a timestamp thing. So maybe the pure form of the language and not thinking about how the language has evolved over time. And then there is always the argument between linguists and computer scientists or contemporary thinking of what is the best way to capture a language. Is it capturing the most pure form for language pre-elevation? Is it capturing the way the language is evolving in order to make sure that then you are addressing the fact of how language is effectively used, and then how people will effectively use AI if you are developing language data set for languages. So I think those are some of the things that usually come up. Additionally, you look at languages that don't necessarily have writing systems, and the question become, if you're looking at it from a speech perspective, how do you represent the text part and other challenges? So you have to borrow from maybe a nearer language or thinking of other techniques that could be useful. So my point is, when you look at it from a community perspective, taking on a lot of different languages in terms of the work that we do, and then it's really difficult to now think about the language differences as from a particular language perspective, which is something that's kind of difficult to present in a paper. So, in terms of the labor part, you will have people that are not just translators or transcriptors, but sometimes you have to go to people that actually understand the language in order to kind of understand what does this really mean in the language context. So finding the right people is also something that is quite difficult, that is not necessarily represented in a typical research paper. It's more of talking about that we the process of finding is quite difficult. but we only talk about like we found people that speak the languages and this is like their contribution and all that. At least from Masakhane's perspective, the the participatory research aspect helps to, in a way, give each of the different contributors some form of um, authorship of the paper, which essentially might not be what others are looking for. So the premise is that Masakhane is built on the fact of like thinking from academic perspective, and one of the incentives for everybody joining is more on the research. So authorship is one of the ways, but that does not apply to every community. And then you have to think about what does incentive mean for different communities. So I think there are a lot of different challenges, and it's kind of recognizing some of these challenges and trying to address them specifically in terms of how languages are represented, how languages are being spoken, and what are we actually trying to represent with the AI that we are trying to build for. So just to wrap up, I think a lot of other layers of challenge is how do you use the AI? So you build data sets that go into models, but what really matters for the communities that you're building for? I think that's something that it's still a challenge, and trying to figure out if a more generalized form of AI is useful for everyone, or thinking about if we should be more concentrating on sectoral AI, say agriculture, and building models that represent agriculture, that enable farmers to do their work more efficiently, might be the solution. So I think these are some of the things that we should think about and continue to figure out the solutions to.
Thank you so much for that, Tajuddin. I think a very important nugget that I've picked from that is there is no single answer for every community, and often we have to think about contextually what has the best value for the community, what has the best value for the speakers of these languages. And at this point, I would love to hear from Dr. Lilian, as she has led a monumental effort in building the Ken Corpus project in Kenya, which covers multiple languages and, in fact, many communities, as well as a key context pertaining to inclusivity for people who use sign language. So I'd be keen to hear from you, Dr. Lilian. What are the costs that have existed in you being able to do this important monumental work, whether in time, trust, or labor, that hasn't always come across on paper?
Thank you so much, Lydia. I think my colleagues have said quite a bit about the hidden costs that comes with building this such kind of communities. Yeah, because at the end of the day, it's really a community, and each community is different because every language is its own community. Yeah? We can say Kenya, but in Kenya there are also all these other words, communities. Yeah, so we have to think about different approaches to getting into and building trust to the different communities. So for me, one of the hard things is not just going to get data, but having the communities be partners in building this data and building the tools. That really gives it a more meaningful sense to the involvement, rather than say, give me your voice and then forget about it. Yeah, okay, or give me your text and forget about it. Can we build a partnership? Can I call you back in evaluation? Can I call you back in trust? Can I call? So it's a continuous participatory process that you work together the community. And that trust takes a long time to be able to build with the different communities. And it's a lot of effort to be able to have that continuous engagement with them as we think about what we do to have our languages included within the language technology space. Okay. And you can think about it, they ask hard questions. Yeah. Okay. What is it in there for me? Okay. Why would I benefit? Okay. What risks are there for me? You know, if people now can be able to understand us, can they come to, fight us? Can they know about our secrets? So they have these questions that talks about their identity as people. So as you can see, trust is really deeper than just saying, yeah, we are collecting this particular word languages. Yeah. And what do they have to say about the use of that kind of their data? What do they have to say about how it should be applied? Should they have a say? Okay. Or should they not have a say? I think they should have a say. At the end of the day, that the primary users, whatever tools we're able to build. So there's a lot of hidden costs in terms of trust for me as a bigger aspect. And also in terms of partnership building, which takes time to build, okay, be able to have a meaningful engagement with the different communities, to be able to participate at the end of it all. Even before we talk about actual technology, okay, simple machine translation system. Can we take it back and they try it and give us feedback objectively, because they know they are co-developers, okay, to this particular engagement. Whether it's testing an LLM, can we try it out with them? So at the end of the day, for us, it's really, really important that it becomes an involvement of a long-term involvement with the different communities from where we get this kind of information. So I think that for me would be the main contribution I have towards the hidden costs of building working communities for the future. Yes.
Thank you so much for that contribution, Dr. Lilian. And I'd like to go a bit further into specific discourse you have brought up in the past about inclusivity of this technology for the community. It's not just for the technical people in the community. Sometimes it's for our grandmothers or people who have a great familiarity of language but are a bit skeptical about technology. Perhaps they've never used a computer or interacted with modern technology in a way that feels comfortable for them. How have you been able to circumvent that generational gap and build trust with them? What does it take to be able to build that kind of trust in such community settings?
Thank you so much. I think, like I said, we have different communities. We work a lot with what we call, they're not community leaders, but persons of influence within the different communities who are able to reach out. Like, for instance, Lilian cannot just go to the Maasai or Kalenjin and say, come and do this. It's not that easy, yeah? We also work with the people from the particular community, okay, who will go and speak because they understand the context, they understand the culture, they understand how to extend an invitation to different age gaps, whether it's the youth, whether it's the older generation, okay, and things like that, yeah, so that we really understand the context. And this came to play a lot when you're working on building the sign language, Kenya Sign Language data set, yeah. I couldn't go there because I am not fluent in sign language, yeah. So at the end of the day, it is person who understands sign language, and even better still, a person who is actually having the sign language as the first language, that is a deaf person, is a better person to contact the fellow deaf community, okay? Because they really understand the context of how they relate, how they work, how they want the system to collect. At the end of the day, you take a background step and say, these are the leaders, these are the community people to engage. You take a back step and allow them to engage, and you support that particular word engage. We don't always have to be the one at the front because you can never understand all contexts that we are able to collect. So with that kind of aspect, we support, yes, but you've built a network with different levels who were also able to reach out to go and reach out to the different level. And that has really enabled us to build this network, okay, and build trust because they see these people of influence and they see them being supported. Like, how do you help your mother or your grandmother to record their voice? You know, you click for them, they record, you click play, and they feel very nice when they hear themselves at the background. How do you support them to do what? To contribute. I cannot support, but we have the leader or members of the language communities to support us in this kind of endeavors. Yes. That's how we have built our trust over the long term. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that. I would say one of the key things that I personally have gotten from this segment and our conversation so far is it's all about the people. It's about including the right people and going the extra mile to ensure that we are taking the right steps to include the context, the nuance, and the communities in the ways that feel most natural for them. The next segment that we'll go into will take this a bit further and think about matters on data and ownership. Who do these models actually work for? And who does this data belong to in the long term? And so the question I'd like to put forward for us here is, if we collected 200 hours of sign language data and put it online, by Friday, Meta will have it integrated into their systems. The community then asks, what's the value that it has for the local ecosystem? Who owns this data? And what community ownership actually means in practice and not in principle. This sentiment, I think, echoes an extension of Dr. Lilian's work. We put together this data with the best intentions to take forward the heritage and the value of our languages, but how do we ensure that we continue to own it going forward? And so I'd like to put this question first to Deborah. Yeah, what do you think on matters data ownership and who these models belong to?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I mean, just thinking about the fact that the moment the data is out there today, then by Friday, someone else would have access to it, right? So, who the data actually belongs to, I think that the data is my data is about me. It's about who I am. If you collect my data, I think it's natural that I claim or have some ownership to it, right? And so, talking about community ownership, I think that it should mean that, first of all, consent, right? Consent should also not be one time. It shouldn't be that because you've given me consent to collect my data or my information, then this should be it. And you don't have to, at any point in time again, come to me to ask me of anything. It doesn't have to be one time, right? Because I should be able to know how my data is stored, how it's going to be used, what are the risks that is put in online, who is going to have access to it beyond you who is collecting the data. And aside that, I think that once the data is also collected, the access to this data to some extent should be governed, in the sense that some data sets, if are made publicly available and no one have to pay anything to get it, I think it's easy for extraction to happen. People would pick this data set and then use it for their own benefits, or yeah, their own good or benefits, and then to some extent might actually harm the main person that this data actually was collected from. And I think it's also important that, as far as community or ownership of this data is concerned, I think it's important to have some sort of benefit or profit sharing, right? It should be that if you build a product from my data or from a community data, there should be some value in return in terms of the community. Either you're building schools, infrastructure, roads, something. There should be some benefit that people get from their data being extracted or used for other things. So, in that sense, I would say that when it comes to community ownership of the data, to some extent, I still think that whoever the data is collected from owns the data and should have some say in terms of how that data is actually being used. And the consent doesn't have to necessarily be one-time thing. And once you give, the person gives the consent, then you use it forever. And yeah, so this is my take on this in terms of ownership.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Deborah. And I think I really love the idea of continually engaging the community and not just taking off one-off consent and determining that as the premise of we can continue to extract data for as long as possible. I'm keen to explore that thought a little bit. So in the course of your work, what models have you found work most effectively when we think about fairness and ethics for African languages, in terms of not just collecting this data, but optimizing models? What models do you think so far have been working effectively, and what recommendations would you give premised on your work?
Okay, so my work. So I've had some work on the NLP side, building like chatbot for African development banks, like I mentioned, and the second part mostly is thinking about fairness broadly on machine learning fairness, not with a focus or application to African-based languages, right? So on the fairness side, the questions I've been trying to answer has to do with the measurements and also mitigating of bias that arise from these ML systems. I think that usually there is usually this notion that, okay, this is how things are done, in the sense that, okay, I first of all would have to make a decision, take information of someone as to what their characteristics or who they are as a person, and then I make a decision on what kind of treatment I give to them. So you can think about a loan approval where it's more like I decide how much money or interest rates you get as an applicant applying for a loan. But usually in the entire framing of machine learning systems, we do not make any considerations that some decisions are more in the power of another person. So, and whoever is making the decision can actually be unfair in terms of the decisions they make for the applicant in question. So it can have some effects on the person's ability to, for example, pay back for a loan in the future or not. So the questions I try to answer from that side is really thinking about what are the ways to which we can mitigate some of the biases that arise from these decisions that are being made on that sense. I don't know if that really answers the question, or maybe I missed your question slightly.
I think it answers the question. I can see a great follow-up question in the comments from Peter. I'd like for us to explore that. Perhaps as we're closing that segment, we'd like to hear from the other speakers on the panel on this specific question. I'd be keen to hear from Tajuddin at this point. Masakhane has been pretty deliberate about participatory research as an alternative to the extractive big tech model. What are the limits that have existed therein? And in what ways can community-led research do what it does? And yeah, to what extent can community-led research do what it does while mitigating the effects of big tech in the ways that we have spoken about it so far?
Thank you. So I think there is need to step back a bit to understand where some of these challenges are coming in terms of the actual potential extraction or the possibility of big tech taking data sets that are being created by communities and used in models. And I think part of it is the funding model of how communities actually got supported, and then the license and agreement that come with that. So, for example, one potential area that this kind of issue comes is some funders specifically would like to see that data sets are open, and their idea or the theory is that when you have data sets that are open, it enables everybody to be innovative. However, because of the power dynamics that do exist, it means that some some organizations are more likely to be able to use that immediately than others, which in such a way, despite the fact that the data that are being created by the communities, they might not get the access to use the data as first users for first advantage, and that would go to a different organization. When it comes to Masakhane, and looking at it from a research perspective, the question is, what is the incentive for creating the data set? As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the community members are in the academic field, and one of the most important incentive for the community, for the members, is the research output, which would go into a publication, which would mean citations and recognitions and all that. So because most of these data sets are then being created by communities that are interested in kind of having that publication, there is some incentive in actually releasing the data as open source because in some way it improves the citation. So that's the other part of it. However, I think there is a middle ground between all of this. Now recognizing that what type of data should have what type of license. And I think that's the most important thing. What is, for example, what I'm saying is if you create data sets in the health sector that is quite sensitive or quite difficult to get, or something like sign language, which is kind of can only be gotten from specific people that speak the language in a specific way, then it becomes really challenging if you don't have a license that protects the people that own the data, the people that can benefit from the data. And then if you have a more general data set in say a language that would naturally be easier to collect, then thinking about a more open perspective that might also be the solution. I think what usually happens is that with a lot of different funders, the creators of the data set still own the data. However, they assign a global open license that means that anybody can use the data in commercial and non-commercial setting. However, there are a lot of different licenses that are now open, and communities can think about what works for them best. Some of them have been created by Professor Chijoke from University of Pretoria, and CPID I know have been doing a lot of work in also creating different types of license frameworks that protect communities. So, true, there are a lot of challenges, especially coming from where the funding comes from and what is the incentive for the communities, and kind of generally how the last few years have played out in terms of lack of data sets and needing to show that we can create these data sets and providing the necessary data sets for the development of language technology. But it's also good to pause and think about what type of data sets we are creating and what license we attach to each of them. And I think there is the potential of negotiating with some of these funders. I know that, for example, Niger Voices, as an example, it does not have an open license, and it has other form of license that is intended to give back to the communities that are creating the data set. And by doing that, the idea is that if a big tech wants to use the data, they are allowed to, but they have to give compensation, which will in which will enable the communities to create more data. In such a way, you are able to have some form of sustainability of continuous creation of data. So I think it's quite important to look at the different aspects of the question and kind of understand the different voices, and then trying to understand from a community perspective what works best.
Thanks so much for that, Tajuddin. I think I have just one more follow-up question for you before we move on to other members of the panel. Building up on the question that Peter asked, when we think about it in terms of practicality and the existing challenges that are there, how are we able to balance these things out when we have a partnership with one of the big tech actors? Currently, if we choose to think about it as a hypothetical, if a big tech actor decides to engage Masakhane on a specific piece of work that is building a sizable data set, what are the practicalities that exist therein? What policy and governance tools and structures exist for us to ensure, beyond just goodwill or the expectation that they should do the right thing because it's the right thing, what tools exist or are in development for us to ensure that we continue to own this important aspects of African heritage, which is language?
So I'm unable to see the question that you're referring to. The chat does. Maybe I'm looking at it from a different thing. No, I cannot see any question. But I'm answering what you have posed in terms of partnerships and kind of. So the first thing is really understanding why we are partnering with any big tech. So say we want to partner, so there is need to have clarity of what is the rule of engagement, what is the resultant output, and who is this intended to serve. I think there should be some threshold of risk associated with different types of data sets that are being created and what it actually means. And then based on that risk or framework of thinking about risk and extractiveness that will come from that, how does this actually take or relate to? So I think, for example, in a practical sense, creating a large amount of data is important. However, what type of data? I think it's not just talking about data as data, but also understanding the exact type of data that is being created. And what does that data represent for the community? And what does that data represent if not created? So understanding these different challenges and different point of view would help to now shape what does this partnership really mean, and what should the community or Masakhane here think about when entering such relationships or such partnerships. In terms of existing models or governance, I think there are a few different works in the African ecosystem that is trying to look at data governance in general. and they quite give some thought in how to approach some of these questions. It might not represent every scenario, but I sure believe that it's a very good start that can help think about some of these questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Tajuddin. At this point, I'd like to hear Bonaventure's perspective on this. In the research space, while you're actively working on building the models, the tools, the infrastructure that make this possible, how are you able to mitigate these existing questions when you think about data and ownership?
Okay, that is a huge and good question. I think as Deborah, Lilian, and Tajin, and everybody else said, like the data ownership question is something very complicated and complex, and like different kind of like context and the output have been like laid out. Uh, I would be honest to say that what I care more about in my research is the potential impact. So it's not directly related to who owns the data, but it's more directed to who could benefit from it. Um, Also the potential harms, like the limitations, like, okay, I intended this work to go in this direction to help in these specific fields, like maybe improve like ASR models and like in transcribing African names, things like that. Can that be misused? If yes, how can it be mitigated? And like research is like an ongoing process, like it can always be improved. So we can do only so much at a time. So it has to be like continuous and like improving over time and everything. So I think that's how I'll answer the question. Like I'm not thinking for about it from like the data ownership because that brings a lot of like legal licensing, all those type of things of issues, which I'm not expert of. But I do make sure, for instance, that whichever data I use, that I properly reference it, cite it. Um, if it's not open source, which didn't happen so far, I have to reach out to the authors and have the permission or like see what it entails using that specific data set. And one thing also that you didn't mention is about the utility, the usefulness. Why are you using it? What type of data it is, and like, what is the intended use of like that data? And having that in mind, then I repurpose it toward who is going to benefit mostly from this work that I'm doing. Because if you remember what I said earlier, I have been shifting away and away and away from like the data, like quote unquote mindset, like saying that they are not enough of the data, saying that there's this and that. I'm acknowledging and I'm embracing that limitation. And I think as Africans, we should embrace that as well. And, you know, if someone has the freedom to do whatever he wants, and you have constraints, I believe those constraints should like empower, should force, should like inspire you, us, everyone here to think differently, do things more optimally, like in a smarter way. So that's why I've been diverging from the data perspective and focusing on like, okay, I know I have those limitations. How can I use them to like build better models, more efficient, more inclusive, like less biases toward some type of people or maybe certain type of like social classes, things like that. And once that is done, in the process, I'll also make sure, okay, since I'm targeting this and this, who is going to benefit from it and who is not. From the who is not, I can think of, okay, if those people are not benefiting from it, is it potentially hurting them? Thinking about the harms and thinking of like maybe not tangible solutions yet, but like thinking about how these could potentially be like safeguarded so that the model or like the usage doesn't go beyond what is it intended for. So I think that was gonna be my perspective, or like uh, when I build the models based on the data that I use, all those type of things, like to the end goal.
Thanks for that, Benaventure. I think that's a very diverse and different way to look at it. The focus is more on the outputs and ensuring that they get to the people who need it. I would be very curious to hear from Dr. Lilian as well. Given that you are working on a very fundamental and important aspect of Ken Corpus, and I can see you also shared a link to the Noodle license. Yes, a link to the Noodle license in the chat. For everyone to have a bit of perspective on it, Noodle is one of the key licenses that's been developed to guide how data and technology that is built by Africans should be able to be used by others, that is respectful and creates value for the creators of that data, be it the communities that are part of the collection of that data or the technologists who are able to put it into models that could be used by others. And so I'd love to hear from Dr. Lilian. What is your perspective on data and ownership, even as you're working on building not just Ken Corpus collectively as a representative of Kenyan languages, but then also the Kenyan Sign Language data set and models?
Okay, thank you so much. I think we stepped back and asked ourselves two questions when you're beginning on experimenting on what is the practicality of a community-based license, yeah? And you thought about it in terms of is language just text and words? Okay, what does language carry? Yeah, and if you think about it like that, then it carries people's realities, it carries people's culture, it carries the whole community history over time. Yeah, okay. And it is important if you think about it not just as from a computational point of view, like I can put it in models and I can get a system. But think about it on the usability point of view, okay? It's going to serve the community for a particular person. And for them, it is important that it carries their cultures and it carries their realities within that data set, okay? And if you think about it like that, then you have to really consider them. What is their take on this instrument that you're developing from them? It's a tool, yes, but the tool, it's used for a particular context and be able to solve a particular challenge, yeah, whether it's health, education, social setup, searching on information, whatever thing it is, yeah. And then we asked ourselves then, if you have to define this ownership, then you have to think about then who is the community itself, yeah. It cannot be the whole Chui community, yeah. So we differentiated between the language community, okay, but there's also the data community, the people who actively took part to develop this particular resource. It can be the people who contributed their voices or the computational linguists or whatever thing it is. Then they form the data community for a given data set, okay? And for them, it would be nice for them to have a say on if they want to use the data, how should it be used? Why they took their time to develop this particular resource, yeah, which actually pushes frontiers. And I think we have seen that for languages that are not under-resourced, okay, then their models are pretty working very well, yeah. I know optimization works to some extent, but when it comes to usability in the field for a domain, you actually need data for that, yeah. At the end of the day, you have to go back to the Luo agriculture people to understand how they farm, then to build an advisory system to support them. There is no way you can be able to get that with so much optimization. Yeah, I think it is core that you think about them as, yes, they're co-contributors and co-developers to this particular tool, and they definitely should think about how do they come in to support continuous development of this tool that is supposed to actually serve them, okay, and actually develop and move forward their languages for prosperity, not just for today. Actually, it's actually for prosperity because it will be used for generations to come if it is built properly with the inclusion as contributors. Yeah. So as we step back for that, then what is in it there for them? Can we have a framework that allows them to benefit from this effort to develop these particular tools for the long term? Okay, and that is why Noodle comes into play to see what can be a potential benefit sharing scheme to allow this work to continue beyond just an initial funding push to collect 10 hours, 20 hours. How can this be sustained enough to be able to collect 100, 200 hours to build an efficient tool that actually works in the field for these people that you intend to serve? And with this backdrop, then we said, then you have to really think about community centeredness as co-creators in developing tools, either for data collection, for evaluation, continuous development, testing. It's a continuous work process. That is really why we are really working on right now, experimenting on how practical community frameworks, how will they govern themselves? Who will be the representatives? Who will, if let's say X wants to send a benefit, what would that benefit be? Can the community structure that? Okay. And then have a continuous engagement as they build these resources and tools for their particular communities.
That's amazing. And I think it sets a really optimistic and positive view for the next segment of our talk. But I'd just like for us to think a little bit about I do have familiarity with the Noodle license, and it is a fantastic piece of work when it comes to the context of licensing. I do, however, recognize the greatest challenge which exists in enforcement. And I think now we can touch a little bit on the comment that was left in the chat by Peter. I will read it verbatim so that those who are not able to see it can take it in. And so he asks, I think the data ownership question might be broken down in terms of legal, practical, and moral aspects. Big tech have loads of power, money to essentially take practical ownership, even in the face of theoretical legal barriers, never mind moral ones. So even as we think about coming up with great licensing models that have community at the fore, to what extent are we able to enforce what is encompassed in those licenses? To what extent are we able to ensure that we continue to have this ownership in the future? I ask this question not as having to come up with a solution to this issue, but really for a moment of reflection, even as you think about the future for Africa and NLP. How can we continue to champion our languages and our cultural diversity and our ownership over it, even as we're heading to a point where data continues to be a very valuable currency and there are power dynamics, very real power dynamics at play? So yeah, this is something for us to just think about. I'd like to allow anyone within the panel who has immediate reactions to that to be able to share it. Or else I can see Susan's hand is up. I'd love to hear from Susan as well. If you want to add on to that, Susan.
Thank you so much, Lydia. And it's been a really insightful conversation. I have one question for Dr. Lilian. So I'm currently learning sign language. My background is as a legal professional. I'm in the space of IP and AI, the intersection of IP and AI, more specifically AI-related IP challenges. But I'm curious on a personal level about linguistics and lexicons, particularly. So my question to Dr. Lilian is, and I believe Tajuddin nudged at this when he spoke about the preservation of lexicons, for example. What do you prioritize when you're creating a data set? What do you prioritize? Do you look at the kind of quote unquote formal language, what is usually kind of in the textbooks and what we're taught in school? Or do you look at the living language as it moves through time, which then incorporates things like slang and various kind of variations? And it's an interesting conversation because you have preservation, which is more like archiving, and then you have capturing the language in that era, in that time. So yeah, I'm curious as to what your perspective is on that, specifically because I think Kenya Sign Language is really interesting because it's signs and not, written. So I'm quite interested to hear your perspective on that. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Susan. That's a great question. I'd just like to reflect a bit on our structure as well. We have 15 minutes towards the end of the session where we entirely focus on Q&A aspects. Would you be okay with us holding on to that question and then being able to take that as our first question once we get to the Q&A segment?
Yes. I mistakenly pressed on the hand to raise my hand, but it's very fine, very much fine. Thank you so much.
That's absolutely all right. Thank you, Susan. So we'll get to your question first when we get to the Q&A section. Our second last segment is going to be a reflection about what we envision as a future. So putting on our best optimistic glasses and thinking about the future we envision for African NLP. And so we're going to pause and imagine, not thinking about the barriers or the challenges that we're very aware of. What do we see? What does it look like concretely in 10 years if our work succeeds? Or rather, when our work succeeds, because we're being optimistic. What has changed at that point? And who is in the room that wasn't there before when we think about African NLP? And so we're being very imaginative, we're being very positive, we're being very optimistic, and we're thinking about solutions for the future in 10 years, which is 2036. What does NLP look like for Africa? So I'd like to start with you, Tajudeen.
Okay, thank you. So what does NLP for Africa languages look like in the next 10 years? I think a couple of things. So the first thing is that obviously, based on how data sets are being created every day, in the next 10 years, African languages would not have as much data as English. However, what Bonaventure mentioned earlier, it's more of thinking on the model side. Given the constraints that we have, how can we build better models that capture the realities of the fact that our languages would always be having less amount of data compared to other languages such as English? So thinking about that as a problem and thinking of how to solve it, I think in the next 10 years, we should be at a point where that should be solved. And once that is solved, it means that the requirement for getting to a model, a useful model, in terms of the data would drastically reduce. Drastically reducing in terms of the data cost, one, what it means in order to fine-tune a model or what it means to actually build a model would also potentially reduce in 10 years. This is because if you look at it from 5 years ago until now, the amount of data that is required to build a model has drastically reduced because of all the other work that has been done. So that's the second thing. Who is in the room? I think it's more of a conversation on thinking about, from an African perspective, what is the most useful use of AI? Conversational everyday AI, specific sectoral AI, and what? So figuring that question and actually bringing the right people in the room to make sure that the AI we are producing in the next 10 years will actually serve the people that matters. So I think to me, that is the future I'm looking forward to. And I believe that it's something that is quite achievable once we look at what have been achieved in the last 5 years. Now, I think exponentially AI has been growing. I know that it's slowing down in the global north. However, it means that would have that exponential growth in the global south.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that insight, Tajudeen. Just to build up on that as we close on that segment for you, based on your experience with Masakhane in the African NLP context for several years, what do you want the people who are watching today, the people who are part of this call, working as researchers, policymakers, funders, and activists in the context of African NLP, what can they do differently starting tomorrow to help us get to this very optimistic goal that we envision for the next 10 years?
To me, I think it's everybody recognizing what they bring to the table. Policy is quite important, government support is quite important, but also communities own the language, communities own the data, and the researchers can be advocates for, even if they are not in the African ecosystem, for building the right tool for African languages. So it's that everybody recognizing the power that they hold and what they can bring and what they can help to see that we build a better future for the African languages.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tajudeen. I'd love to hear next from Dr. Lilian. From your perspective, what do you envision for the next 10 years? And what can we all together do to help us get there?
Thank you so much. I think it's an interesting question because part of the question we asked ourselves at some still committee with the Masakhane is, what is this future look like for us? When we will see, yeah, we've made it, yeah, what will happen at that particular point in time, yeah? So, and we ask ourselves then, if you look at our barriers, there are quite a number. We can talk about them forever, okay? But then if we think about our successes, then how will our successes look like? And for me, I'll think about it in three main facets, yeah? So we have a challenge in capacity, yeah? So our future will be then, we really move forward into, there will be a kind of, not just a community, but real technical researchers, yeah? Or people able to build that kind of system working actively to develop different tools and different aspects, yeah? So that we really have an active engagement within the community of developing, and there'll be no challenge in terms of that, yeah? Other major challenge I think that we face again is issues around, capacity and compute, okay? Then that means that at now, we will have set up infrastructures to allow us to be able to develop. Whether it's like, for instance, there's a framework that in Kenya that looks like how can universities partner to have like a common centers where everyone can be able to get into. We can't build for every university, but can we have a framework for that? Yeah, then that could be a success. Can that be across different continents? And no one has to worry about, oh, we can't train models anymore because we have a kind of not centralized but kind of federated center that you're able to share resources and maybe subscribe at a lower fee and things like that that you're building for our Kenyan ecosystem. Okay, and the main other challenge is data set. Then that other one, it's really asking ourselves that the hard question in policy: why are we under-resourced? Okay, if we reflect on us as a community, then it is us who have to change our mindset on how we approach our data. I ask myself, can I give this same discussion in my local language? Probably no. Then whose fault is it that Luo is under-resourced? It's my fault. So can we change our mindset in education, in policy, that will enable us actively be daily generators of our language in the digital space? Then there'll be no talking about under-resourced anymore. And that is a fundamental mind shift in our education and in our policy framework that will allow us to continuously build and not have to worry about, oh, we need to collect more data in X, Y, and Z. It will be kind of day-to-day, output in our endeavors. So if we put such kind of structures in place, yeah, that will be a future that no one needs to worry about compute or capacity or data sets and things like that. And we can actually be on the same page when it comes to about, we'll be actively on the tables where discussions around such kind of tools are being talked about. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I love the optimistic lens. This is a great way for us to wrap this up. I'd be keen to hear from you, Bonaventure, as well. What do you envision in the next 10 years when we think about research, infrastructure, tooling, and models?
Okay. So when I look at like the 10-year reason, been super duper optimistic. I think I see a lot of like in practice, AI for African by Africans. By that I mean a lot of development in the sense of as like Dr. Lilian said and Dr. Eugene said, applications that are owned by Africans for African problems. I always say that we shouldn't be running or like it's not a race against like what like other regions in the world have done. It's good. We can learn from it and adapt it to our own like, realities, own like, solutions, own challenges. But it's also important for me because we're talking about like the ownership of the data, but what about the ownership of the model? Because yes, we do need data, but we also do need model to have the application. So both work like hand in hand. So from that aspect, which I'm the most interested in, I guess in 10 years, I see more, maybe uh, more quote unquote Afrocentric architectures, new learning paradigms developed by Africans, that work for the African context. Of course, it can go beyond, but like that are mainly tailored for that. So that means like driving innovation in that sense. Um, Having, I also think of like huge or like worldly um, recognized conferences. Currently, they aren't. We can think of like deep learning in Java, but they can be more like things of like the scale of iClear, ICML, MNLP, those type of things, but specifically for the African languages. I was once talking with few Professor Graham and Antonis. I forgot his last name. It was back in like 2022, 3, where I was like, like there's the EACL, which is the European chapter. There's the AACL, which is like the Asian chapter of the ACL. There is NACO, who is like a North American chapter. So I was like discussing with them about, okay, so why not having an African chapter of like the ACL? I think we had some brief discussion, but back then I was only becoming a master student, so the discussion didn't really like push further. But like those are things that I think could be done to drive students, researchers, practitioners. I'll say governments, even though I'm not so into those people and the whole political landscape, but putting all that together to really drive forward the innovation and the intellectual property. Not just, okay, Meta has his model and then like we just create our data, fine tune and adapt on it. No, I think that's too much easy. At least from now, that's how I see it. That's why I was saying earlier, I'm very diving away from just the paradigm of like creating new data, more data, and just like fine tune it on like use cases. We have to really like own it from like the core, like from the ground, the zero, on every stage of it. So being optimistic about like a 10-year vision of African NLP, I think that's where I see us owning our models, owning our architectures, owning our technologies, and obviously owning our data and like being very sovereign on like all those aspects.
Great. So this is a very exciting future to envision. More sovereign aspects that are centered on African-centric technology for our languages. And yeah, I think we should have an ECL chapter. That's definitely something we can make happen. In closing, I would like to invite Deborah to give us her perspectives on what you
Okay.
envision as the future.
Yeah, I really love all the points all the panelists raise and the kind of future they envision. So just to add up, what I would envision is more of data sovereignty, where data will be subject to our laws, regulations, and governance structures of our nations, right? So that even if you have to use, say, an African based data set in, say, Europe or in America, you still have the laws of the country still governing even the usage in terms of this. And that then means that, in a broad sense, I also envision where power has actually shifted, power dynamics, where communities have more control and ownership over technologies that are even built from their technologies to begin it with. And also having the case where people whose voices would have never been heard would actually be more represented or part of the conversation. So this is the kind of future I envision, particularly with the power dynamics, that things would change, and yeah, we are all on an even playing field. So I know this is ambitious, but yes.
I I love the spirit of ambition and positivity that's all around. And just I think to really wrap up the Q&A on this very high note, I'd like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to share just one sentence that you want the people who are with us today to carry with them going forward, even beyond the end of the festival, something to think about as a nugget of wisdom on African NLP. Just one sentence. I'd like to start with you, Bonaventure.
I think I'll pass my turn first.
That's fine. Tajudeen, are you ready?
You know, I'm very not good with short sentences. However, I think we have proven in the last couple of years that as Africans, we do have what it takes. So we should continue on that path.
That's great. I'd now like to pass it on to Dr. Lilian. What's your one sentence?
I think let's retrospectively ask ourselves, why are we under-resourced? If we can really answer that, then we will not have to worry about NLP.
Very, very introspective. I like that. Deborah, are you ready with your one sentence?
Okay, I would say that whilst building models, let's always stop to also ask ourselves what happens or who gets harmed if it fails.
Mm-hmm. Care. That's very important and valid. Care is a key component of how we need to be thinking about building the future. Thank you for that. Bonaventure, are we ready?
I think so. I can say let's make use of our limitations, like everything we know from the data and everything perspective, to build more culturally and like all the African centric architectures, models, and everything to empower and enable like what we envision like in 10 years or like 50 years. So yeah, I think that's what I can say.
Thank you so much for that.
I think it was more than a sentence.
This time we'll let him go with the fact that it's a complex sentence. We'll let him have that. So I think that brings us to the end of this core aspect of our conversation, and we shall spend the next 15 minutes on Q&A. I'd like to first thank so much our panelists for taking the time to have this exchange, even as we go into the Q&A. We've gotten a few questions as the conversation has been ongoing, and I'd like for us to start with Susan's question, which was focused towards Dr. Lilian, and just talking about an interest that she has specifically in linguistics and I think computational linguistics. Please correct me if I'm right, Susan. Or if I'm wrong.
You're almost there. So
Okay.
it's yes, computational linguistics, yes, but more the specific question was about what to prioritize for lexicons. Should I add more, or is that?
Maybe just a bit more context.
Okay, sorry.
It's
So,
okay.
with regard to building data sets and the understanding of language as a living thing, what is prioritized in that context? Is it the kind of quote unquote formal language, as we would learn in school, or is there a consideration for the evolution the language kind of goes through while being used by different people in different times and different eras? And I guess, what is there a consideration for that, or based on the parameters or the requirements for, of course, creating a data set, are you limited, or, the direction goes towards a more formal type of lexicon? I hope that's a bit more clear.
Yeah, I think that's really clear. So I'd like to put that to you, Dr. Lilian.
Thank you so much, Susan. I think that is a fundamental question that we actually ask ourselves before any data collection effort. The question that we really ask ourselves is, what is the purpose? purpose, because you don't just collect data and recomes. I'm collecting it. No, what is the purpose? The purpose will define the how. Okay. So, for instance, let me give you 2 example projects. You're going to build an advisory system to allow farmers to ask questions in the local language about their products. What do you want to capture? Do you want to capture formal Kikuyu, or do you want to capture how the farmers ask questions? Okay. There you want to ask how the farmers ask questions. So you collect that. Okay. Whether they code switch, whether they use whatever, that is how they ask the questions. And the system should be able to do that. So that is because it's for that particular purpose. If you're trying to build a learning tool for Kikuyu, then ask yourself, what is the grammar of Kikuyu? Then you collect for that. Yeah, those are 2 different contexts. So always think about the what, or then it defines the how. Yeah, you're going to collect. We are building sign language data sets to be able to support people with hearing impairments to be able to participate in class, in quotes. Okay. Then you ask ourselves, then how do they understand their language? Okay, we go to the community of the schools or special needs school and ask them, how do they understand their language? They speak Kenyan Sign Language, yes, but there are regional variations. Okay, fish could be this in Luo, fish could be that in someone else. They all mean fish, yeah. It's the same. It's kind of synonyms if you think about it like that, yeah. But there could be a standard KSL because there are people who actually define what sign language is standard. Okay, do we capture all of them? And the answer is yes, yeah. Because at the end of the day, sometimes when people to reach out to them who are also learning, yeah. So in the same context of spoken language, we also apply it to what? To sign language. We want to understand what is the formal and what are the regional variations. Because at the end of the day, they could use them in a speech and your system fails to recognize it. Then what else? Yeah, so we capture both levels. So I think that if that kind of helps you, we really focus on, what is the purpose, then we define how we go about the data collection process.
Yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Lilian and Susan. I can see Matthew is typing as well as dancing. If you'd like to ask your question verbally as well, that's completely fine. We can do hands up and then we can go chronologically. As we wait for these upcoming questions, I'd like to ask Peter if perhaps we've been able to answer the question you had before in discourse as we are having the conversation on licensing.
Am I audible? Yes, I should be. Yeah, I think so. Thank you so much for an interesting conversation. And I think that my question or comment was really sort of about the distinctions between the sort of legalities and practicalities of data and data ownership and so on. I think that's been somewhat well addressed by the panel. So thank you for that.
Thanks so much, Peter. I saw a hand up, but it's not up anymore. Matthew. All right, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for all of the contributions. They've been very, very valuable. And my question was to do with a comment that Dr. Lilian made, actually, regarding looking at why the African economy is under-resourced. And I was wondering, are there any resources that are currently lacking in Africa that could potentially be mitigated with AI? Like, for example, there are ways in which some institutions or companies or businesses are looking into making technology that is able to take digital solutions and allow that for there to be access to healthcare, for example, from away from hospitals using technology. But are there any other ways, or are those the kind of routes that we think resources could be best, or tech or technology or just AI in general could be used to be able to mitigate these lacking resources?
Right. Thanks so much for that question, Matthew. Dr. Lilian, will you be able to take that?
I'm not sure if I really understood. When we talked about under-resourced, we talked about more in terms of most of our African languages do not have sufficiently large enough digital footprints that models are able to draw from to build this technology. So that's what I mean by under-resourced. into that context. Yeah. So that then the technology is lacking, not because there are no models for us to build, but because the models require the data, and the data is not in digital form because languages are inherently spoken, they're not written. Okay, so it can't capture that anywhere for the models. Yeah. So that is the essence of it being under-resourced. Even though it has millions of speakers, there's no digital footprint enough for the models to be able to proceed. So in your context then, it means that if you are to build solutions and you think about how are the best ways for us to be able to, to come up with these models that are able to use less data probably, okay, but also how do we efficiently, generate data to allow us to build that kind of systems. I don't know if I got your question correct, Matthew.
Yeah, that second part was exactly yeah. Like, are there ways in which we're able to maybe capture data better, or you better utilize limited access to data? So yeah, thank you very much for your response. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that. I can see your next question touches on data and models. How does one add to the body of work for another, or is everything distinct and discrete? I would like to put this towards Bonaventure. Would you be comfortable taking this question?
Um, so I would like to know how data and models in one African way add to the body of work of others. No, like it's not distinct and discrete. There've been, I think, a lot of work for me, for my colleagues at like with Masakhane and other institutions that show that we can have what we call cross-lingual benefit. So, for instance, I assume that you don't have enough data, for instance, like every I mean in font, and then you have enough data in every, which is like a language which is like belongs to the same language family as font, and also is geographically closer. So you can actually use the array, like data, knowledge, however you want to call it, to uh, to improve the performance on like our main language. So roughly, um, I think it depends on how you model it, but a language can benefit, like languages can benefit to one another while building the models. So no, it's not like discrete and distinct. No, it's not like one model, one language. No, they can all benefit from one another. Um, how this work has led to more leading knowledge in what a minimum viable data set might be. I'm not sure I understood that specific question, like the second one.
I think the question is, what has this body of work enabled us to determine what a minimum usable data set would be for us to be able to build models that are
Mm,
consequential, that create
okay,
value for communities?
okay. So there have been a lot of findings. For instance, there was a paper we published at NACO, which was in 2022. We're trying to look at, I mean, the paper's title is a few thousand translation can go a long way. Roughly, where we looked at how many minimum sentences we need to be able to outperform like a basic transformer in like the multilingual translation setup. And like turns out that if you have a good quality of data, for instance, um, you can beat your base model with just I don't know a few thousand, like thousand. Some language were 2,000, some languages are 1,000, so it was minimal. Um, and then there've also been like other works. I forgot the papers. Like there was like one which was about like Masakhane, which is the 2.0 version, and some of also of my works that have shown that you can actually build thing like good performing models with very minimum data, like with just maybe even a set of like hundreds, you can actually build something very useful. Um, but most of those things usually exploit highly pre-trained languages, which brings another problem and which has been like well documented about the fact that having the language in the pre-training set enables a lot of things. So those are also, for instance, like some of the theoretical aspects I've been covering in my research. When you don't have such cases, like how do you do your training? And when you have such cases, how do you do your training? So I think it's not like one fit all rule. I really depend on like what you're working on, what the purpose is, and like the downstream application. But definitely, there've been work that have shown that with very like few hundred or thousand, like you can actually do pretty decent good job on like downstream applications, NER, machine translation, sentence topic classification, all those type of things.
I think that's a really good all-encompassing answer. I can see you're a bit low on time, but we have a couple of questions pending. Leila's hand is up, and Tanson asked, I think, a really important question. So I think we'll go with Danson's questions, and then I can take yours, Leila. So that be fine?
Of course, but mine was not really going to be a question, just being mindful of time. I know, especially because one of the speakers has to leave really right on time. So I was going to actually suggest that maybe we can take Danson's question and redirect it to the live discussion to have it continue there. But since you said it's such an important question, maybe we can just answer it really quickly in like a minute or two and then just do closing remarks. Up to you, Lydia.
So we'll have Danson's question as the last question. Probably you can build it up in more detail later on. Danson's question is the youth in general, an example in Kenya, are slowly ignoring local languages. We know that a language can be born, can grow, and even die if the youth are losing touch with regional mother tongues. Who will be left to use them in the next 10 years? And more importantly, who will provide the real-world data needed to update and train our models? What approach must we take right now to ensure the next generation actively sustains local language AI? I'll put this as an open question to the panel for whomever feels the most inspired to answer it. Any takers?
I can go for
Okay.
time's sake so that we are able to get through. So the question has already to me been answered in a different way. The question is languages do evolve, and the question is how do we capture the language at the moment that it matters to the people that speak the language. So if you look at English or French or any of the high resource languages, the language has evolved. Like the way English is currently spoken is not the way it was spoken as 200 years ago, meaning that we need to understand what we are capturing. Initial set of data sets that like models that were built on Shakespearean work, you see that the way they speak or the way they represent English was in that perspective, which is not how we're using English now. So I think this is what would happen to languages as well in Africa. Languages will evolve, the way it's been captured is going to change and all that. So the question is what matters to the people, the most authentic form of the language or the way it's been spoken.
Thank you so much for that, Tajuddin. And definitely, Danson, please feel free to add that to the discussion segment so we can talk about it a bit more and get additional perspectives from other people working in this context. At this point, I want to thank you all for making the time to be a part of our session today. These exchanges have had immense value, and I've learned so much from every single one of you. And I'm happy to hand this back over to Leila.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lydia, for the amazing moderation and all of the speakers for their incredible insights. To me, really, the reminder that language is not just a neutral container, but that when your language is really missing from the model, your reality is missing from the system too, is something so important to take away from this. And it really kind of makes clear that the question of who builds AI and the question of whose world AI reflects are not two separate questions, but really one and the same. So yeah, incredible session. Thank you so much. And we next up have another amazing panel that's going to start in just a little under half an hour. Next up is the Peace AI, the NYU Peace Research and Education Program, who will be taking us to the Global South to further look at what genuine community authority over AI actually looks like in practice, drawing on real work from Malawi, the Philippines, and Kenya, really offering a complementary and sometimes slightly different vantage points on some of the same underlying tensions that we just heard about in this panel. So yes, all come and join us. It's going to be another amazing one. And in the meantime, feel free to drop all of your remaining questions, reflections in the community chat so we can keep the discussion going. And yes, if you haven't registered for the next panel yet, we're going to drop it in the chat right here so you can hop on over to the next one shortly. Thank you so much.